welcome back. So glad you're here. This video is going to walk you through a contemporary simplified moral argument for theism and try and show how Aquinas' view that being and goodness are identical undergirds or supports or maybe grounds an argument for theism that relies on morality. So let's examine a simplified moral argument with objections and see how the identity of being and good can be used to overcome those objections. Some philosophers, for example, William Lane Craig, have sought to use the existence of a moral order rationally to imply the existence of God. Take, for example, a simplified moral argument. Now, I've heard Craig use this in his debates. I think one of the more famous debates Craig that I've used in my courses is his debate with Christopher Hitchens. And I think he uses this type of argument there, but you could probably find it in other of his works. If God does not exist, then objective moral values don't exist. That's premise 1. Premise 2, moral values exist. Therefore, God exists. This is a modus tollens type argument. If not P, then not Q. Not Q. Therefore, not P or P, which is God exists. Okay. So modus tollens with a couple of negations. Okay. As Bagot and Walls state, this is Bagot and Walls have this book called The History of the Moral Argument, or History of the Moral Argument, or Moral Argument History, or something like that. I think it's with Oxford edited volume. Excellent book. If you are interested in the moral arguments for theism, read that book, especially the historical arguments. So they conclude that the conclusion obviously follows from this simplified moral argument from the premises, so detractors need to try to call into question at least one of them. End quotes. Let's quote from them. So how might that go? Well, let's take a look at the logic here for some clarity. Consider the following SMA in a formal manner. So this is a little hard to do on YouTube videos. Put this up on the screen, but if you're just listening to this, you just have to follow along. Sorry, this is maybe mean to do this for an audio version of this, but here it goes. So consider the proposition P, God exists, or has being. Q, God exists. Good exists, qua morals. Good, qua morals exists, or has being. So basically, this is if Q, then P. Q, therefore P. That's pretty simple. If good exists, God exists. Good exists, therefore God exists. Pretty simple. Okay. To defend the soundness of SMA, that's the simplified moral argument, the theist needs to argue for the truth of Q and P. But immediately a puzzle arises. If the conditional is only treated as a material or truth functional conditional, then there's no necessary relationship between P and Q, and only a truth functional one. In other words, if Q is granted to be true, then the argument for the soundness of SMA hinges on the truth of P. But if the conditional is only truth functional, then the moral argument is not really about morality at all. It is simply an argument giving evidence for P, moral or otherwise. Okay, this is kind of a puzzle about the logic of these kind of simplified moral arguments. You have in order to argue for the soundness, you have to argue for the truth of both premises. But to do that, you have to argue for the truth of Q, namely that good exists, and for P as well. Okay, so that's kind of interesting. So to consider this, then consider that to defend the unsoundness of a simplified moral argument, an atheist can argue for either A, the truth of Q, namely Q that goodness exists, and the falsity of P, so that would be to attack premise 1 if P then Q, if Q then P. So in other words, an atheist can argue that that good exists is true and that God exists is false. Or, this is kind of interesting, or the falsity of Q, that goodness doesn't exist, and that premise 2 is false. Okay, so let's look at these possible options. For option A, an atheist might argue that Q is true, namely that goodness exists, by granting that it is a brute fact. This might require giving up naturalism or materialism, but it doesn't necessitate theism. An atheist might argue for the falsity of P based on a putative a-theological argument that God doesn't exist. For example, the problem of evil, or the failure of theistic arguments. But once an atheist grants Q to be true, the soundness of SMA is simply reduced to the evidence for P. Right? So in other words, if an atheist and a theist agree that good exists, then the question over the simplified moral argument is just a question over whether or not God exists. It's kind of a funny thing. So option B is to argue that good doesn't exist. The atheist could ignore premise 1 and simply deny premise 2, namely maintain that the good doesn't exist. One could argue that there are not moral realities, but only practices, or maintain some sort of moral skepticism. Hence, the evidence for or against theism is irrelevant to the soundness of the argument. So if the atheist attacks the soundness of a simplified moral argument in the first premise, that modus ponens if Q then P, if good exists then God exists, the issue boils down to evidence for theism, moral or otherwise. In other words, that argument is just shifted now to arguments for theism. If the atheist attacks the soundness of SMA, simplified moral argument in premise 2, well, again, premise 2 is just the premise that good exists, the issue boils down to evidence for the existence of morals, or moral goodness, or just goodness in general. And theistic evidence, or lack thereof, is irrelevant. Right? So, in other words, theistic evidence doesn't seem to enter into the question of whether or not good exists, at least should in this particular case. So a demonstration of the unsoundness of SMA boils down to either good evidence for the existence of God or good evidence for the existence of goodness. There are several ways to strengthen SMA-type arguments. One might be to modify them to abductive rather than inductive arguments. That is to say, premise 1 is not simply a material conditional, but rather an explanatory one. If Q, then P. If good exists, then God exists. This isn't just a logical relation. It's a explanatory relation. If good exists, then God best explains that. Then you're moving to an abductive inference to the best explanation rather than a pure deduction. If morals exist, then what best explains their existence is a personal God or something along those lines. This is what Craig seems to have in mind in his various debates, for example, the one I mentioned with the Christian religions. But I think a better way to strengthen simplified moral argument type arguments, or the arguments that are similar to SMA type arguments, is to keep them deductive. So I like the deductive part. I think that's stronger than induction. If you want to disagree with that, that's fine. Talk about that. But is to keep them deductive, but to include the identity of being and goodness established by Aquinas that we've discussed above in the paper and in a couple other videos. If Aquinas is right, then if anything that exists, including moral values, then there must exist a reality which is existence identical to goodness itself. Thus, any affirmation of the existence of moral values will give us natural, albeit minimal, theological knowledge. While such a thin natural theology might not give us the God of a particular religious tradition like Christianity, it might, as Dallas Willard says, give us the ontological space for the God of religion. Okay, now that might have been too much too quick, so let me go back to this. So if Aquinas is right, if I'm right in my previous arguments in this paper and other videos, that being and goodness are identical in things, then and if that implies a formal reality, that existence is identical to goodness itself, then necessarily the affirmation of anything that exists, including moral realities, entails the existence of a reality, a formal reality, of existence identical to goodness itself. In other words, we have a universe. Dallas Willard uses this language in his paper called "Language Being in God," a three-part case for theism or something like that. I can't remember the subtitle. It occurred in a addendum to a book on a debate by J.P. Moore and Kai Nielsen back in the 90s, the 80s, a long time ago. And he talks about how the God of religion might be possible or more plausible in someone's belief structure if you can demonstrate or show, just from natural reason, that the universe is quote-unquote haunted. I really like that term, but it's a possible reality that there's a being that exists that is being and good itself, that's identical to itself. Okay, and I think that's what Aquinas' arguments give us. And if that's right, the Aquinas' argument's not for the existence of God, but for the existence of good, the four ways to good. That's what it gives us. So that necessarily any argument, even any arguer, that affirms the reality of anything that exists, has to acknowledge the identity of being and good, and a formal reality that exists, that shows up in everything that's real. Namely, the formal reality is the identity of being and goodness. So in other words, our universe, our cosmos, and I don't mean the physical universe, I mean all that's real includes a being, which is being and goodness identical to themselves. Now, again, that's not Christian theism, but I'm not sure Christian theism can be true if that's not true. Okay, so, all right, let me consider two possible objections to this type of simplified moral argument. Consider again the atheist's two routes to demonstrating the unsoundness of a simplified moral argument. A, the truth of Q, that good and the falsity that good exists, and the falsity of P, that God exists as being, show that premise 1 is false, or B, the falsity of Q, to show that premise 2 is false. If Aquinas is right, then option A, defending Q, entails the existence of a formal reality, existence identical to goodness itself. But this implies that a thin view of P is true. Okay, so again, that might be a little quick. So in other words, if I tried to show that the premise of the argument, which is if Q, that if goodness exists, then God exists, is false, then I have to, if I want to show this false, there's only one way that can be false, and that's if Q is true. Anyway, the good exists is true, and P is false. Or P is the antecedent of that conditional. Sorry, the consequent of that conditional. Let me repeat. The conditional is if Q, then P, where Q is good exists, P is God. Now, if I'm an atheist, I want to show that that's false. There's only one way it can be false, and that's if Q is true, namely the good exists, and P, that God exists, is false. It's the only way it can be false. But if I affirm that Q is true, by trying to show that whole proposition is false, by affirming the truth of the antecedent, false of the conclusion, then necessarily defending Q, that good exists, entails the existence of a formal reality, existence identical to goodness itself. That implies a thin view that P is true. So what I'm saying here is if you try and defend that good exists, you're already defending that God exists, because being and good are identical. And if being and good are identical things, that implies a formal reality, the identical of being and goodness. That's a thin kind of theism. Let me know what you think. I think the logic is pretty good there. So if Aquinas is right, then any defense of Q entails that premise 1 is true, or so in a thin sense, a being that everyone calls God. So that's option A. Option B is to show the falsity of Q. If Aquinas is right, that is to try and show that good doesn't exist. There's no such thing as good. Showing the falsity of Q, but if Aquinas is right, then showing the falsity of Q would entail that there's no being either. Now that's kind of a bummer. So if Aquinas is right that being and good are identical, and you try and show that that goodness isn't real, then you're claiming there's nothing real. Now, I don't even think you could be a solipsist and believe that, because nothing's real. I'm not existing alone either. But this is absurd. So if Aquinas is right, being and good are identical, then in either of these two objections to a contemporary SMA, simplified moral argument, then either theism is true or the atheist's denial of Q is absurd. That is, the atheist's denial of the existence of goodness is absurd. This would be an unfortunate position for these atheistic objections to theism. Now, I hope I don't have a straw man here. I'm just trying to consider one possible objection to a simplified moral argument that relies on Aquinas' identity of being and goodness and the formal reality that flows from it. The truth of Aquinas' arguments that being and good are identical logically forces an atheistic view into such a position. The identity of being and goodness found in Aquinas militates against atheistic objections to a moral argument, serving as an undercutting defeater to those objections. Aquinas is a common sense philosopher. This is the conclusion part of the paper. Aquinas is a commonsensical philosopher. It makes it plain that we can know about what is real through our ordinary sense perception. However, he doesn't simply stop at common sense. And probably no good philosopher should. It's a good place to start. Maybe not the only place to stop. He leads us to metaphysical knowledge of the nature of being, the nature of reality itself. In his metaphysical work, he clearly shows that for the things we experience with our senses, to be is to exemplify an essential nature. From this metaphysics grounded in common sense, he further argues that things we experience in this life are also good. More importantly, he demonstrates in the 4 ways to good, I'm borrowing from Stump and Kreitzman, that being and goodness are identical in things, even though we can think about them distinctly in our minds. Neither Aquinas' metaphysics, being his essential exemplification, nor his metaethics, being his identical to good in things, is inert in its philosophical implications. So Aquinas' metaethics and his metaphysics don't just stay there in their nice little silos. They're going to apply to everything. Ethical theory, applied ethics, bioethics, politics, you name it. And here I'm just dealing with one implication, namely moral arguments for theism. Aquinas' metaethics and metaphysics are meant to point us to the source of being and good. In this paper, I've argued that the validity of Aquinas' arguments for the identity of being and good can undergird a moral argument for theism. One purpose of such a philosophical move allows a simple moral argument for theism to be presented more like a cosmological argument, more in line with Aquinas' fifth way discussed above in the previous video. For if anything exists, then God exists, where there's a tight metaphysical relation between being and God. But if there's an identity between being and good, then any affirmation of being entails an affirmation of good, and vice versa. And the affirmation of either appears to entail a formal reality, the identity of being good, distinct from any particular being or good. This work in natural theology and natural agathology, it's a study of good, opens the ontological space for the possibility of leading our atheistic or agnostic interlocutors to know the truth of Jesus' claim that no one is good except God alone. Thanks for watching.
Stay psyched, Grom. You.